Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Deuteronomy. We're still in Deuteronomy chapter 4. We're going to start our reading today at verse 32. Now we're going to wrap up chapter 4 in this session. We've seen in the last couple of days that the focus of chapter 4 is loyalty to the Lord. To remind the Israelites that it is the Lord who redeemed you from Egypt. It is the Lord who has made you his people. It is the Lord who is going to give you possession of the promised land. You are to worship only the Lord. This is sort of a prologue to the law, because the heart of the law is that loyalty to God, worship only him. And I was kind of wrapping that thought up as we see verse 32 and following. Listen carefully to what Moses says. Ask now about the former things long before your time, from the day God created human beings on the earth. Ask from one end of the heavens to the other. Has anything so great as this ever happened? Or has anything like it ever been heard of? Has any other people heard the voice of God speaking out of the fire as you have and lived? Has any God ever tried to make for himself one nation out of another nation? By testings, by signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, or by great and awesome deeds, like all the things the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? You were shown these things so that you might know that the Lord, he is God. Beside him, there is no other. You need to remember how God delivered you from Egypt, because nothing like this has ever happened before. There's nothing like it in history of what God did for you, how he redeemed you from Egypt, took a group of slaves and made them into a nation. All in fulfillment of the promise he had made to your forefathers, to Abraham so long ago. Now God has done it. I remind you of these things, Moses said, so that you might know that the Lord, he and he alone is God. Beside him, there is no other. Now, when you go in amongst the Canaanites, you're going to find they worship other gods. They're idols. And they're going to try to lure you away to worship as they do. You will be tempted. So I want you to remember what God has done for you and how he has shown you that he and he alone is God. Beside him, there is no other. And then notice what Moses says in verse 39. Acknowledge and take to heart this day that the Lord, he is God, in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. Keep his decrees and his commands, which I am giving you today, so that it may go well with you and your children after you, and that you may live long in the land that the Lord your God gives you for all time. Acknowledge the fact that there is no God except the Lord. Worship only him. Moses keeps repeating this because he knows the temptation to Israel will be to worship the gods of the Canaanites. He knows that's going to be their temptation. So he's trying to strengthen them against that, reminding them that only God can deliver, as he did you from Egypt. Only God can do that. The Lord, he is God. He's done this. Only God can give you the promised land. But the Lord, he will do it. So worship only him. You might think, why were the Israelites so prone to idolatry? Why were they so prone to worship the gods of the Canaanites? After all that God had done for them, after all that Moses had told them, why were they so prone to that temptation? Because there is a temptation to be like everybody else. One of the strongest temptations is just to fit in, to be like everybody else. The Israelites would be tempted to be like all the other folks around them, all those Canaanites, to be like everybody else. We're tempted to the same thing. Sometimes we just want to fit in, and we're tempted just to go along in order to get along. The temptation is to be like everyone else. But God reminds us, I and I alone am God. Worship only me. The foundation of biblical faith is loyalty to God, that he and he alone is God, and he alone we will worship. So as Moses wraps up chapter 4, he's reminding the Israelites of what God has done, because he alone is God. So worship only him. Now when we get in chapter 5, he starts giving the law in particular. He's going to restate the 10 Commandments, and all these things are there. But chapter 4 is sort of a prologue to all of that, just to remind them, worship only God. And if you do that, your life will be full and you'll stay in the promised land forever. Worship only God. Join us tomorrow as we continue our 5-minute Bible study in the book of Deuteronomy. And tomorrow we'll start looking at chapter 5.